The NFL draft is just 3 weeks away, and I thought it'd be a great time to dive into Field Yates' two-round mock draft and see what he's got in store for the Atlanta Falcons. Before we jump into the details, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. So if you're not on board yet, hit that subscribe button. Now let's break down Field Yates' mock draft. Kicking things off in round 1, we've got Cam Ward going number 1. No surprises there. Following him are Abdul Carter, Shatter Sanders, and his teammate Travis Hunter rounding out the top 4. That's pretty much what I expected, but I'll throw in my 2 cents. I don't think Shatter will go as high as some folks believe. Next up, Mason Graham heads to the Jaguars at 5, which I've seen a million times. Then Ashton Jenney goes to the Raiders. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Jets, at 7, pick Armin Membo, a right tackle from Missouri. The Panthers at 8 grab what I consider one of the top 2 players in this draft for the Falcons, Jalen Walker, the linebacker out of Georgia. Following that, Shamir Stewart goes to New Orleans. Let's pause for a second to talk about Stewart. While Walker feels like a bit of a long shot, I can see Stewart going anywhere from New Orleans at 9 to the Eagles at 32. This pass rusher class is all over the place. It's really a matter of preference. It's like choosing between a great Chinese, Italian, or Mexican restaurant. They're all fantastic in their own way, but it comes down to what you like. For me, I prefer pass rushers with some solid production. 1.5 sacks? Not interested, no matter how athletic you were at the combine. Football is played with pads on, not in Indianapolis in February. So, I'm going to pass on Shamir Stewart for Atlanta at pick number 15. Moving on to number 10, as we get closer to the Falcons at 15, the Bears select Will Campbell from LSU, a solid left tackle. The 49ers grab Walter Nolan, a defensive tackle from Ole Miss, and T. McMillan, the Arizona receiver, finds a new home in Dallas. Will Johnson goes just 2 picks before the Falcons to Miami, and then Tyler Warren falls all the way to the Colts at 14. Now with the 15th pick in the 2025 NFL Draft, the Atlanta Falcons select Mike Green, a defensive end out of Marshall. Let's talk about this pick because Mike Green is a name that keeps popping up in Falcons mock drafts, making this offseason pretty exciting. There are a handful of names being tossed around for pick 15, but let's focus on Green's production last year with the Thundering Herd. He led the nation with 17 sacks, an absolute breakout season. He also racked up 23 tackles for loss and 59 pressures. Some people doubted him because he played in the Sun Belt, but go watch the tape against Ohio State. He faced some linemen who are likely to be picked in the first 2 rounds of this mock draft, and he held his own without any issues. Now, Green didn't test at the combine. He opted to showcase his skills at his pro day, and he absolutely crushed it. His 3-cone time, which is a great measure of a defensive end's agility, was 6.85 seconds. If he had tested at the combine with that time, it would have been the best by a mile among all linebackers and defensive linemen. Iowa's Jay Higgins led the combine with a time of 7.01 seconds. Now, it's important to note that many of the heavy hitters didn't test at the combine, so we're missing out on some of the best athletes, like Abdul Carter and Mike Green. If Green had tested, he would have finished first in the 3-cone drill and just barely missed out on the top spot for the 20-yard shuttle. Let me be clear about my stance on testing. I don't put a ton of weight into combine or pro day results for certain positions. Sometimes pro days have a hometown stopwatch, and if you've noticed, the times can be off by more than just 1/100th of a second. For example, a Texas running back was clocked more than 1/10th of a second faster in Austin than he was in Indianapolis. Something doesn't add up there. Ultimately, I'm looking for football players, not track stars. How many times have we seen the Falcons draft a great defensive player or an athlete who looks amazing on paper, only to find out a few years later that it just didn't work out? No one seems to remember that he was super fast that one day in February in central Indiana. That hasn't happened to me yet, so I'm focused on finding players who can actually play the game. Now let's get back to Mike Green. I think there's a solid chance he could be the pick for Atlanta, but there are some skeletons in his closet. He transferred from Virginia to Marshall, and he's been accused of sexual assault not once, but twice. No charges have ever been filed, and he denies both incidents. One allegedly happened in high school and the other at Virginia. His time at Virginia was a bit strange. He didn't play, then he played, then he didn't, and then he transferred. A lot of people speculate that the transfer was related to the allegations, so teams will need to do their homework on Green to ensure they're comfortable with the character of the player they're getting, not just the guy who racked up 17 sacks last year. So do I want to see Atlanta select Green at pick 15? If Will Johnson and Jalen Walker are off the board, I think he's probably my preferred choice for the Falcons. I'm also considering him alongside Michael Williams and James Pierce, but I'd be very much on board with Green at 15. Now let's see who the Falcons passed on. A couple of offensive linemen went off the board between Arizona and Cincinnati. I don't think they're going to go for a receiver, especially with Matthew Golden heading to Seattle. Keep an eye on Malachi Starks, the Georgia safety, but I wouldn't put too much stock in that. As for Amari and Hampton, no way. They're not taking a running back, and they're definitely not going for a quarterback with Jackson Dart going to the Steelers. I also don't see them taking a tight end unless they really want to move on from Kyle Pitts. Michael Williams falls to the Green Bay Packers at pick 23, and he's been a tough one to figure out. I've seen mock drafts where he goes as early as New Orleans in the top 10, and others where he lands around here at 23. No one seems to have a solid read on where he'll end up. I'm going to say 4 edge rushers go in round 1. Michael Williams, Mike Green, Shamir Stewart, and James Pierce. So far, we've only seen 3 of the 4 edge rushers, and we'll get to James Pierce Jr. in just a bit. At pick 24, the Vikings select Jahdae Barron, the versatile DB from Texas. I love his ability to do it all, and I think that versatility will translate well to the next level. The Texans then grab Donovan Jackson to bolster their offensive line, followed by Kentucky DB Maxwell Harrison heading to the Rams. Finally, James Pierce Jr. goes to the Ravens at pick 27. Let's take a moment to talk about Pierce because he had an incredible 2023 season. In fact, some of those early 2025 mock drafts that popped up right after last year's draft had him going first overall to the Carolina Panthers. So it's quite a drop from that lofty position to somewhere around 26 or 27. 2 main reasons stand out for why his production dipped. First, he finished the year with 7.5 sacks, but he didn't have the impact in some of the bigger games that many of us hoped for. The second concern is about his locker room presence. There have been whispers from high school teammates and even some chatter from Knoxville that he might be a bit of a head case. He's got a little bit of that Andy Bernard vibe going on, dealing with what I like to call a case of the grumpies. So, any team considering investing a first-round pick in him will need to do their homework to ensure they're comfortable with his character. At pick 28, the Lions select Derek Harmon out of Oregon. I don't think Atlanta will go for Harmon, but if they're looking to replace Grady Jarrett, he's a solid option. Then we have Nicky Minari, who I believe is my favorite safety in this class. He's built like a linebacker but runs like a safety, and he heads to D.C. The Patriots are adding to their offensive line after selecting Travis Hunter, and they trade back into round 1. The Raiders also make a move to select Luther Burden, and the Eagles wrap up the first round with Jihad Campbell, a linebacker out of Alabama. I've seen his name pop up in mock drafts for the Falcons a couple of times, so don't sleep on him. Personally, though, I'd pass. I just don't think he's that outstanding as an inside linebacker. Sure, he played a bit at outside linebacker in high school, but Jalen Walker is the only tweener I'm willing to consider because I think he's an incredible player. Now, Campbell was the best player on Alabama's defense last year, and I'm not saying he's not a good football player, but for what Atlanta needs on defense, I'd prefer a more traditional edge rusher, unless we're talking about two exceptions, Campbell and Jalen Walker. Before we move on to the rest of today's mock draft and check out the round 2 selections, I want to give a shout out to our friends at Prize Picks. Springtime is here, and baseball season is officially underway. Don't miss your chance to add your favorite players from the diamond to your Prize Picks lineup. Whether it's strikeouts, RBIs, or first inning runs, you can take your pick of more or less for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. For example, if you were like me watching the Braves game late last night in LA, you could have taken the less on all the Braves batters because it seemed like no one wanted to hit that ball. So check out Prize Picks today. They call Georgia home. It's an awesome way to add a little excitement while watching baseball, especially during those long 162-game seasons that can get a bit dry at times. And speaking of excitement, the second half of the basketball season is heating up as teams push for the playoffs. Prize Picks is the best place to catch all your favorite sports action. Download the app today and use code CNS to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. All the details are in the comments and description of today's video, so don't miss out. Now, let's dive into round 2 of the draft. We've got a couple of names to keep an eye on, starting with the Tennessee Titans. They've selected Donovan Isuku, a defensive end from Boston College. This is a name I think I should be learning more about because if Atlanta decides to surprise everyone and go for a corner or an interior defensive tackle in the second round, Isuku could be a solid option. He had an incredible production year for the Eagles, racking up 16.5 sacks, just shy of Mike Green's numbers. After a quiet couple of years, he really broke out in 2024, and I see a lot of athletic upside in him. However, playing at Boston College might have kept him off the national radar, and he didn't have that big shining moment in a major game to really put himself on the map. I like that pick for the Titans a lot. Another name to watch is Kenneth Grant. If Atlanta is serious about replacing Grady Jarrett early in this draft and finding their new anchor for the interior defensive line, Grant could be the guy. Sure, they picked Rook last year, but if they want to double down, Grant has an incredibly high ceiling. The only concern is that there are games and quarters where he just disappears. But at 331 pounds, he moves like a cat, and someone is going to fall in love with this kitty cat. Next up, we see Josh Simmons and Tyler Booker, a couple of linemen, go off the board, followed by Amika and Jaden Higgins, a pair of receivers. The Bears add another running back, the Jets select a tight end, and the Niners bolster their line with Trey and Henderson heading to the Cowboys. Now, with the 46th pick in the NFL Draft, the Atlanta Falcons select Darius Alexander, a defensive tackle out of Toledo. Here's some background on this rocket of a player. He stands 6 feet 4 inches and weighs 335 pounds, so from a physical standpoint, he checks all the boxes. He's got the size and the length, but he doesn't have the best initial burst. He played 6 years at Toledo and was named second-team All-MAC this past season. Now, I don't want to put all my faith in media awards, but if you're playing 6 years in the MAC, I'd hope you could at least be first-team All-MAC. I'm not sure who was ahead of him, but it's no one who went before pick 46 in this draft. That raises a bit of a red flag for me. If you're going to play 6 years in a Group of 5 conference, I'd expect you to be a country mile ahead of everyone else if you're going in the top 50 of the draft. He finished with 3.5 sacks, so you're not exactly looking at someone with incredible pass rush upside here. Darius Alexander did show some flashes and potential, but the more I read and watch about him, the more I think he could be a decent rotational player. But let's be real. At pick 46, I'm not looking for just a good rotational player. You want someone who can make an impact, and I'd hope to have a higher-ranked player on my draft board than a rotational defensive lineman at that spot. There are plenty of players I would have preferred over Alexander. For instance, I would have taken Nick Scorton over him in a heartbeat. I'd also have gone for Azare Thomas out of Florida State, who went 49 to Cincinnati. Even Chevron Brown, the corner from ECU, who has great physical traits, good length and speed, would have been a better choice, despite suffering a torn ACL early in 2024. I could have even been convinced to go with Jared Wilson to replace Drew Dahlman at center. Another name to keep an eye on is Benjamin Morrison. If the Falcons go for a pass rusher in round 1 and want to add to their secondary in round 2, the Notre Dame corner could be a solid target. Unfortunately, he didn't have much of a season in 2024 due to a season-ending hip injury. For someone so young, suffering a hip injury is a big red flag because those don't usually heal quickly. Teams will need to be comfortable with his medical history. If the Falcons are okay with it, they could be getting one of the best corners in this class. You might wonder how he fell to 46. Oh, it's just some medical stuff in college. Who cares? If he's healthy, he's a steal. But if that hip injury slows him down, it could end up being a bust, similar to Caleb Farley going to the Titans a few years back out of Virginia Tech in round 1. Another name worth mentioning is J.T. Tuimoloau, the Ohio State defensive end. He had an incredible finish to the 2024 season and was a key player in their national championship run, racking up 4 to 5 sacks in the college football playoff. He's a high-production player who was a big-time recruit for the Buckeyes. It took him a little while to find his footing in Columbus, but his last year showed why he was such a coveted prospect for Ryan Day. As we round out the rest of round 2, no one really jumps out to me. Maybe the Notre Dame safety Xavier Watts or Tate Ratledge out of Georgia if you're looking to replace Drew Dahlman. The Saints are trading up for a quarterback, Will Howard, so keep an eye on that. Jacob Parrish goes to the Bills as another corner, and Landon Jackson and Alfred Collins, 2 defensive linemen, round out picks 63 and 64. Speaking of Collins, he's another name to consider as a potential replacement for Grady Jarrett. He's a big guy at 6 feet 5 inches and 330 pounds. That weight can fluctuate a bit, as teams prefer players at a controlled weight to perform at a high level. He's a 3 technique, similar to Jarrett, but his pass rushing ability might not match Jarrett's. Still, I think he could have a solid career in the NFL. To wrap it all up, let's recap what the Falcons did in this mock draft. They selected Mike Green, a defensive end out of Marshall, and Darius Alexander, a defensive tackle out of Toledo. I'd give this a C. You have to weigh the first-round pick more heavily than the second-round pick. I like the Green pick, but I don't love the Alexander pick. I'd have loved it if it were 2 other guys, Jalen Walker or Will Campbell, but they went before us. You could definitely do better than Darius Alexander at pick 46, in my opinion. That's going to do it for today's episode. I really appreciate everyone tuning in. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up button on your way out, and I'll see you all next time.